In 1914, Sir Ernest Shackleton's Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition pushed into the Weddell Sea, where the Antarctic horizon gradually stopped behaving like a boundary and began to feel like a sealed perimeter of drifting ice and silence. The ship Endurance advanced into waters that had defeated earlier navigation attempts until the open sea narrowed into a shifting white field that moved without warning, trapping progress in a landscape that appeared still but was never stable. What follows is not simply a survival story, but a reconstruction of how 28 men became cut off inside a place where direction, distance, and time stopped agreeing with one another. You will move through the documented sequence of events that pulled them from exploration into isolation, from a functioning expedition into a system of drifting ice and disappearing certainty, where every decision carried consequences that could not be measured until long after it was made. Frozen passage into the Weddell Sea. The Southern Ocean opens around South Georgia like a widening ring of steel-grey water, where wind does not so much pass over the surface as press into it, and in late 1914, the Endurance sits within this vastness, with the quiet certainty of a ship still believed to be ahead of its own limits. The vessel, commanded by Ernest Shackleton, as part of the Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition, has already crossed from Europe and South America through a long sequence of preparatory stops, and here, at the edge of the Antarctic convergence, there is a final moment of relative stillness before the sea begins to change character entirely. South Georgia, with its whaling stations at Grytviken and its steep glacier-carved interior, becomes the last point of familiar human structure before the expedition turns southward into waters that are only partially mapped and never predictable in their behaviour. Nothing in the outward scene suggests immediate danger, yet the ocean's surface carries a subdued tension, as though the water itself is holding back information it has no intention of revealing. When the Endurance leaves South Georgia in December 1914, it enters the Weddell Sea region, a section of the Southern Ocean known among polar navigators for its dense pack ice and long seasonal delays in ice breakup, where even well-timed expeditions can find themselves locked into immobility for weeks or months. The ship, a 3-masted barquentine built for polar conditions and strengthened for ice navigation, moves southward with a confidence shaped by experience and planning, carrying men who are not strangers to Antarctic waters, yet who are still dependent on conditions that cannot be controlled or negotiated. Early progress appears deceptively steady, with open water giving way to scattered ice flows that drift like broken plates across the surface, shifting slowly under the influence of wind and current. These first fragments of ice do not yet form a barrier, but they introduce a rhythm of obstruction and release that begins to alter the expedition's sense of forward motion, as each passage through the flows requires careful navigation and increasing attention to the density of the surrounding field. As the ship continues deeper into the Weddell Sea, the ice begins to change from isolated fragments into a more continuous presence, forming broader fields that move with their own slow internal pressure systems driven by wind patterns and ocean currents beneath the surface. In documented accounts from the expedition, the crew observed how the ice was not static but alive in motion, closing and opening in response to forces that were invisible yet persistent, creating channels that could disappear within hours and reappear in altered form. The Endurance, designed to resist crushing pressure, finds itself operating within a shifting boundary where open water becomes increasingly rare, and each attempt to advance southward is measured not in distance gained but in hours of opportunity before the sea closes again. This gradual transformation is not marked by a single dramatic moment, but by a steady accumulation of resistance, where the ship's progress is slowed not by a wall, but by a field that tightens with quiet inevitability. The Weddell Sea itself has long been recognised by explorers and naval records as one of the most ice-heavy regions surrounding Antarctica, with pack ice that can extend hundreds of miles and persist through seasonal changes in ways that defy expectation. Within this environment, even experienced Antarctic navigators have historically described conditions that shift without warning, where leads of open water can appear and vanish in the span of a single day. For the Endurance, these conditions begin to define the expedition's rhythm, as the crew adjusts sail and engine power in response to openings that are never guaranteed to remain accessible. The surrounding environment becomes less a route and more a moving system, one that does not accommodate passage so much as temporarily permit it under unstable terms. In this space, navigation is reduced to interpretation of motion rather than prediction of outcome, and every advance southward carries the implicit understanding that return routes may already be closing behind. By late December 1914 and into early January 1915, the ice conditions intensify to the point where the ship's movement becomes intermittent, with long pauses between short advances as the surrounding floes press closer together and begin to exert measurable pressure on the hull. Historical records from the expedition describe how the ship would sometimes be trapped in place, surrounded by ice that shifted subtly but never fully opened, creating a sense of suspended motion in which time itself seemed to stretch without direction. The crew continues daily operations under these conditions, maintaining watches and routines that are now framed by the need to observe the ice as much as the sea, while Shackleton and his officers monitor changes in drift and compression patterns that suggest a narrowing field of escape. What had once been a passage into the Antarctic interior begins to resemble a gradual enclosure, where the boundaries of movement are no longer defined by navigation, but by the structural limits imposed by ice. In this growing stillness, the Southern Ocean reveals a different kind of presence, one that is not immediate in violence, but persistent in pressure, shaping the environment through accumulation rather than forceful impact. The Endurance continues forward, but forward itself becomes increasingly conditional, dependent on gaps in the ice that appear less frequently and close more quickly than before. Each shift in wind or current alters the configuration of the surrounding pack, and the crew is left to interpret a landscape that changes without warning, where familiar reference points disappear beneath the surface and re-emerge in altered positions. The expedition's confidence, still intact in outward form, begins to exist alongside a quieter awareness that the environment has already begun to dictate terms that cannot easily be reversed. Far ahead, the sea no longer behaves like an open route, but like a tightening field of frozen movement that waits without urgency and closes without sound. The ice that refused to move. The Weddell Sea should have offered a kind of interpretive clarity at this stage of the voyage, at least in the limited sense that experienced polar navigators expect from familiar ice regions where patterns of drift and seasonal opening can still be read with some degree of reliability. Yet what surrounds the Endurance now does not present itself in any such readable form, as the horizon flattens into a continuous, fractured brightness that offers no stable indication of direction or distance, only a shifting field where even the distinction between sea and ice begins to lose definition. The surface appears calm at first glance, but this calmness is deceptive in a way that is difficult to measure without movement, because everything visible suggests stillness, while nothing beneath it confirms stability, and the ship continues forward into an environment that no longer provides consistent spatial reference points for progress. In documented Antarctic observations from early 20th century exploration, this region is repeatedly noted for the unpredictability of pack ice formation, where wind patterns and ocean currents interact to produce constantly rearranging fields that can give the illusion of openness even as they tighten around anything attempting passage. It is within this deceptive visual order that the sense of forward travel begins to erode, not through sudden obstruction, but through the gradual removal of certainty in what constitutes open water at all. Within scientific observations of Antarctic pack ice behaviour, the Weddell Sea is repeatedly described as a region where continuous wind-driven compression shapes the ice into shifting mosaics that behave less like solid ground and more like a slow-moving field under pressure. And in this environment, the distinction between movement and stasis is not immediately apparent from the surface alone. The flows do not simply drift independently, but interact under sustained force, rotating, sliding, and pressing against one another in ways that redistribute energy across wide areas, so that what appears to be scattered fragments from above is in fact part of a larger system responding to atmospheric and oceanic pressure beneath it. For a vessel moving through such a system, progress depends not only on the existence of gaps, but on the persistence of those gaps long enough to be reached, and in this region, those openings are increasingly transient, formed by shifting alignment rather than fixed pathways. Even when passages appear wide enough to permit entry, their geometry is not stable, and the surrounding ice responds to wind changes and subtle current shifts with a responsiveness that steadily reduces the predictability of navigation. During repeated attempts to advance southward, navigation becomes dependent on fleeting gaps between ice masses that appear without pattern and disappear before any sustained passage can be secured, forcing constant reassessment of direction that cannot rely on previous conditions as a guide. The Endurance moves into these openings when they exist, but the openings themselves are no longer aligned in a way that supports continuous travel, and each advance becomes an isolated event rather than part of a steady progression. The ship's course is therefore shaped less by planned trajectory and more by immediate environmental availability, where decisions must be made in response to conditions that are already in the process of changing. In such circumstances, the idea of a fixed route loses practical meaning, replaced instead by a sequence of temporary alignments that never extend far enough to form continuity. At points where separate flows converge under sustained force, the ice does not simply meet, but bends and fractures vertically, producing ridged formations that indicate how pressure is being redistributed beneath the frozen surface, and these formations accumulate gradually across the field in ways that alter its internal structure. These pressure ridges are not static barriers, but the visible expression of ongoing compression, where ice is forced upward or downward depending on the intensity and direction of movement within the surrounding pack. Over time, such formations begin to define the texture of the environment itself, creating uneven surfaces that complicate even short-range movement and further reduce the number of viable channels through which a ship might pass. The effect is not immediate blockage, but progressive narrowing, as each interaction between ice masses contributes to a denser and more complex structure that resists simple navigation. Over extended periods of minimal movement, routine onboard observation begins to shift toward environmental tracking, where subtle changes in ice alignment replace distance travelled as the primary measure of progress, and attention becomes focused on whether surrounding formations are opening or closing rather than on any meaningful advancement southward. The daily rhythm of the expedition, still maintained through watches and operational discipline, increasingly centres on reading the ice itself, interpreting shifts in spacing and pressure as indicators of whether movement might be possible in the near term. This shift in focus reflects not a single event, but an accumulation of conditions that gradually redefine what constitutes motion, as the ship's position becomes increasingly dependent on the behaviour of the surrounding ice field rather than its own propulsion. In this way, the environment begins to function as the primary determinant of possibility, while the vessel remains in a state of conditional readiness that is rarely able to translate into sustained travel. As the available channels of open water diminish further, what once functioned as an intermittent passage gradually loses continuity entirely, leaving only fragmented spaces that cannot be reliably connected into a navigable route, and each attempted alignment reveals how quickly those fragments are reshaped by surrounding pressure. The ice does not settle into a single configuration, but continues to adjust itself in response to wind and current, closing previously observed openings and altering the spatial relationships between flows in ways that prevent the formation of a consistent path. What remains is not a solid blockade in the traditional sense, but a field in which movement is no longer supported by continuity, where every potential route is temporary by nature and subject to immediate dissolution. In this condition, the idea of progress becomes increasingly abstract, as the surrounding environment no longer provides the structural stability required for sustained advance. As the last remaining openings close without sound or warning, the ship finds itself held in a silence of motion that no effort seems able to break. A ship named Endurance, now without endurance. Through the narrowing space where open water once briefly existed, the Endurance now experiences the surrounding ice not as a distant boundary, but as a continuous presence pressing against its outer frame in shifting, uneven contact, and what had earlier been interpreted as a temporary obstruction is beginning to take on a more persistent physical character that cannot be understood through navigation alone. The Weddell Sea, already known from polar records for its dense and mobile pack ice, has moved beyond the stage of intermittent interference, and the ship is now operating within a field where movement is determined less by intention and more by the immediate response of ice under pressure-driven drift. At the surface, there is no single defining wall or visible barrier, only a continuous assembly of flows that subtly rearrange themselves in response to wind and current, producing an environment where passage is not clearly denied, yet no longer reliably available. In this setting, the vessel's position becomes increasingly defined by what surrounds it, rather than any measurable progression through space. Historically documented polar ship construction in the early 20th century relied on reinforced wooden hull systems designed to distribute external ice pressure across curved structural beams, yet such designs still operated within limits imposed by sustained lateral compression, particularly in regions where pack ice is capable of exerting continuous force over extended periods. The Endurance itself was built with such reinforcement specifically for Antarctic service, intended to withstand contact with ice rather than prolonged entrapment within it, a distinction that becomes increasingly relevant as surrounding flows begin to press from multiple directions rather than a single side. In polar maritime conditions, ice pressure is not a static load but a dynamic one, shaped by wind-driven movement and the slow but constant shifting of large ice masses that can accumulate force gradually without immediate structural failure. It is within this context that the ship begins to experience conditions that fall outside the expected range of intermittent contact and enter a state of sustained structural engagement with its environment. Beneath the layered structure of the vessel, mechanical stress begins to translate into audible patterns, where intermittent creaks and deeper structural groans emerge from within the hull as pressure transfers through timber and fastenings, creating sound without a visible source. These sounds are not uniform or predictable, but occur in response to shifting external forces, suggesting that different sections of the hull are responding independently to variations in surrounding ice contact. In documented accounts of ships operating in heavy pack ice, such auditory signals often correspond to changes in load distribution, rather than immediate damage, reflecting the way wooden structures flex under uneven external pressure. Within the Endurance, this transformation of force into sound becomes an ongoing condition of existence, where the ship effectively communicates its environmental interaction through internal resonance rather than visible movement. Throughout the enclosed living spaces of the ship, operational routines continue with deliberate consistency, as crew members maintain scheduled duties even as external pressure conditions increasingly define the limits of physical stability, preserving a structured rhythm that remains formally unchanged despite the evolving environment outside. Tasks such as watchkeeping, equipment maintenance, and material inspection continue in their established patterns, reflecting standard maritime discipline even as the ship's mobility becomes increasingly constrained. This persistence of routine does not interrupt the external conditions but exists alongside them, creating a dual reality in which procedural order remains intact while physical progress diminishes. The continuation of these routines becomes less an indication of normal operation and more a stabilizing framework within an environment that is steadily reducing the effectiveness of movement-based activity. Along the exterior hull surfaces, shifting ice masses establish prolonged points of contact that expand gradually rather than abruptly, creating zones where force is distributed unevenly across the ship's structure, with certain sections bearing more sustained pressure than others, depending on the orientation and movement of surrounding flows. This uneven distribution is a characteristic feature of pack ice under compression, where individual ice blocks interact and transfer force through chains of contact rather than uniform surfaces, resulting in variable stress points across any object embedded within it. For a vessel positioned within such a field, the external environment does not act as a single compressive entity, but as a collection of interacting pressures that shift over time, altering how and where force is applied to the hull. These variations do not necessarily produce immediate structural failure, but they introduce a persistent condition of instability that prevents any return to fully free movement. Within the confined observational routines of the expedition leadership, assessments of condition become increasingly focused on material integrity and environmental pressure patterns rather than any expectation of navigational continuation, as attention shifts toward understanding how the ship is responding physically to its surroundings. This shift in focus reflects a practical response to changing conditions, where traditional navigation becomes secondary to monitoring structural resilience and external environmental behavior. Observations of ice movement, pressure changes, and hull response begin to form the primary basis for decision-making, replacing earlier emphasis on directional progress. In this way, the ship is no longer evaluated primarily as a means of travel, but as a system under sustained environmental influence requiring continuous assessment. Over extended periods without effective forward displacement, the relationship between engine effort and actual movement begins to dissolve, leaving only incremental structural responses to external resistance, where power input no longer corresponds to measurable progress through the ice field. The absence of consistent movement does not present itself as a single failure point, but as a gradual decoupling between intention and outcome, where operational effort produces localized reaction without broader advancement. Within this condition, the vessel exists in a state where its systems remain active but no longer translate into navigational change, and the surrounding environment continues to reorganize itself independently of onboard actions. The distinction between being underway and being held begins to lose practical meaning as both states appear to produce similar external results. Through the persistence of surrounding pressure, without any visible shift in intensity or direction, the ship exists in a condition where every vibration of its structure seems absorbed into an unchanging field that offers no path forward or back. The long stillness beneath the polar sun. Within the uninterrupted compression of surrounding ice and motionless pressure fields, the Endurance remains suspended in a condition where external force no longer produces visible change in position or orientation, and what defines this stage of the voyage is no longer the question of progress, but the sustained absence of any measurable shift in the surrounding environment. The Weddell Sea, already shaped earlier in the expedition by the gradual tightening of pack ice, now presents a field that appears unchanged over extended observation, where the arrangement of flows and ridges holds a consistency that resists the expectation of drift or opening leads. From the perspective of early 20th century Antarctic exploration records, such conditions are not described as static in an absolute sense, but as systems of slow internal adjustment where movement occurs at scales too gradual to register in daily navigation. Yet for those aboard the Endurance, the practical effect is indistinguishable from stillness, as no alteration in position can be confirmed against any external reference point. During the Antarctic summer period in the Weddell Sea region, continuous daylight removes the conventional separation between night and day, disrupting the natural rhythm by which maritime activity is normally organised, and replacing it with a continuous visual environment in which time cannot be easily segmented by light change. In polar regions south of the Antarctic Circle during this season, the sun remains above the horizon for extended periods, producing a sustained illumination that eliminates the contrast between active and resting hours as it would be experienced in temperate navigation. Within this condition, the ship operates under constant visibility of its surroundings, yet visibility itself does not translate into environmental change, and the surrounding ice remains visually present without offering new variation in form or structure. This creates a perceptual environment where light no longer indicates transition, and where the absence of darkness removes one of the primary markers by which time and movement are traditionally understood at sea. Across the vessel's operational framework, established procedures continue in sequence, although the absence of measurable displacement causes traditional navigation references to lose functional meaning, as charts, bearings, and course adjustments no longer correspond to observable change in position. Maritime practice at the time still relies on structured routines of observation, instrumentation, and logging, yet these systems depend fundamentally on the assumption that recorded input will correspond to spatial movement over time. In the current condition, that relationship becomes increasingly abstract, as repeated measurements confirm consistency without progression. The ship remains active in every mechanical and procedural sense, but its activity no longer produces the expected outcome of travel through space, creating a separation between operation and result that gradually redefines the purpose of routine itself. From the perspective of sustained observation, the surrounding pack ice maintains a largely consistent arrangement over extended intervals, presenting a visual field that offers little indication of directional transformation, with ridges, flows, and fractured surfaces appearing in stable relation to one another across repeated viewing. In documented Antarctic conditions, pack ice can maintain large-scale structural coherence while still undergoing internal stress redistribution, meaning that visible stability does not necessarily indicate the absence of force. However, without a shifting reference frame, such internal changes cannot be readily perceived from a fixed point on a ship embedded within the field. As a result, the environment presents itself as a continuous surface rather than a dynamic system, where the usual signs of drift or opening water are no longer clearly distinguishable within daily observation. Over prolonged intervals without navigational progress, temporal measurement aboard the expedition shifts away from distance-based tracking and becomes structured around repetitive onboard activities and maintenance cycles, as days are no longer defined by travel milestones or environmental transitions. Shipboard timekeeping in polar expeditions traditionally depends on a combination of navigational logs, scheduled duties, and environmental observation. Yet in the absence of movement, these systems lose their external reference and become internally self-referential. Tasks continue to be performed in their intended sequence, but their significance changes, as completion no longer corresponds to advancement through geography. Instead, repetition itself becomes the only stable indicator of passage, creating a form of continuity that is no longer tied to direction or displacement. Inside the enclosed environment of the ship, attention gradually concentrates on minor variations in sound transmission, light diffusion, and structural response, as these become the primary indicators of environmental interaction, replacing broader navigational cues that are no longer meaningful under conditions of immobility. In wooden-hulled vessels operating in polar ice, sound often travels through structural components in ways that make internal changes perceptible, even when external conditions remain visually unchanged. Small shifts in pressure, temperature, or contact with surrounding ice can alter the way vibrations move through the frame, making subtle auditory changes more informative than visual observation. Within this environment, perception becomes increasingly refined toward these minimal signals, as they provide the only available evidence that external conditions are still active rather than entirely static. Through continued exposure to unchanging external conditions, even minimal deviations in ice behavior or internal vibration begin to acquire disproportionate significance within onboard observation routines, as the absence of variation amplifies the importance of any detectable change. In environments where constant transformation is expected, small shifts are typically absorbed into broader patterns of movement, but in a stable field, they become isolated events requiring attention. This adjustment in perception does not alter the physical environment itself, but it changes how that environment is interpreted, as meaning becomes concentrated in phenomena that would otherwise be considered routine or negligible. Over time, observation becomes less about tracking change and more about confirming whether change is occurring at all. Amid the uninterrupted stillness surrounding the vessel, a faint but perceptible shift in the balance of external pressure begins to register within the structure itself, as though the environment is preparing to act after an extended silence. The moment the ice began to crush the ship, what had remained imperceptible within the broader field of surrounding ice is now registering as a sustained transfer of force into the vessel's outer structure. The Endurance finds itself in a condition where environmental presence can no longer be separated from direct mechanical engagement, and the distinction between being surrounded and being acted upon begins to collapse into a single continuous process. The Weddell Sea, long documented in Antarctic exploration records as a region where pack ice is shaped by wind-driven convergence and large-scale drift systems, no longer presents itself as a field of passive resistance, but as an active structural environment where motion within the ice translates into redistributed pressure across everything embedded within it. What had previously been interpreted as a static enclosure now reveals itself as a dynamic system operating at scales of force accumulation that are not immediately visible on the surface, yet increasingly evident in how the ship responds to its surroundings. Historical observations of Antarctic pack ice under wind-driven convergence describe how previously stable formations can compact into denser configurations, increasing lateral pressure through the cumulative motion of interconnected flows, a process driven not by singular impact but by continuous rearrangement across wide ice fields. In such conditions, individual ice masses do not need to collide violently to generate force. Instead, gradual shifts in position create sustained compression that transfers energy laterally across the pack, producing regions of intensified pressure that can persist over extended periods. For a vessel positioned within this system, the result is not a single directional force, but a distributed network of pressures that vary depending on how surrounding flows align and adjust. The environment becomes less a barrier and more a mechanism of continuous structural influence, shaping anything within it through ongoing reconfiguration rather than abrupt contact. Designed for polar endurance, the wooden framework of vessels like Endurance relies on curved structural ribs to distribute external stress, though prolonged compression gradually reduces the effectiveness of this load-spreading capacity, particularly when force is applied repeatedly from multiple directions over time. The hull's construction reflects early 20th century polar engineering practices, where flexibility and structural absorption were prioritized over rigid resistance, allowing ships to withstand intermittent ice contact while maintaining navigational capability. However, the limitations of such a design become increasingly relevant under sustained environmental pressure, where the frequency and duration of contact exceed the intervals required for full structural recovery. In this state, the hull does not fail in a single moment, but begins to operate under cumulative strain, where each episode of pressure alters its response to the next. Deep inside the ship's structure, vibration patterns begin to change in frequency and consistency as externally applied pressure travels through timber joints and internal framing in increasingly continuous waves, producing audible responses that shift with variations in external load distribution. These vibrations are not random but correspond to changes in how force moves through the hull, revealing the pathways by which external pressure is transmitted into the vessel's interior framework. In polar ship construction, sound often becomes an indirect indicator of structural stress, as wooden components respond to compression through flexing and internal friction that produce detectable acoustic signals. Within the Endurance, this transformation of force into sound becomes an ongoing condition of awareness, where structural response is no longer purely mechanical, but also perceptible through continuous auditory change. At multiple contact zones along the hull, the ice field ceases to behave as a uniform mass and instead applies uneven, shifting force shaped by ongoing movement within the surrounding pack, resulting in pressure variations that differ across the vessel's length and depth. These variations are consistent with documented behaviour of pack ice under dynamic environmental influence, where flows are subject to independent motion even while remaining part of a larger interconnected system. As a result, the ship is not subjected to a single cohesive force, but to multiple interacting pressures that change over time, altering the distribution of stress across its structure. This unevenness prevents any stable equilibrium from forming between the vessel and environment, as no two moments of contact are identical in their configuration. Recorded observations aboard the vessel begin to concentrate on specific structural responses, as different sections of the hull demonstrate varying levels of resistance under changing external load conditions, shifting attention away from general environmental description toward localized mechanical behavior. In maritime practice, such observation is critical for assessing the condition of a ship under stress, particularly in environments where external forces cannot be directly controlled or avoided. By monitoring how individual sections respond, it becomes possible to infer the distribution of pressure and anticipate areas of increased vulnerability. Within the Endurance, this analytical focus becomes increasingly important as the complexity of external force patterns grows, requiring constant interpretation of how structural responses correspond to environmental change. After extended exposure to sustained compression, the hull no longer fully returns to its original form between pressure cycles, indicating that the material response is entering a stage of permanent deformation, where elasticity is no longer sufficient to restore the previous structural configuration. In engineering terms, this represents a transition from reversible stress response to cumulative structural alteration, where repeated force application begins to alter the baseline condition of the material itself. This shift does not manifest as sudden failure, but as gradual deviation from original form, detectable only through comparison over time rather than immediate observation. Within the vessel, this condition signals a fundamental change in how the structure interacts with its environment, as each new pressure cycle builds upon the effects of the previous one. With the ice continuing its slow and persistent rearrangement under environmental forces that do not diminish or pause, the ship remains held in a condition where structural response alone is no longer sufficient to define its stability within the surrounding field. Abandoning endurance, life on the ice. Following the progressive limitation of structural viability aboard the vessel, operational focus shifts outward as remaining functional activity is redirected from the ship's interior toward the surrounding ice surface, not as a sudden abandonment of order, but as a gradual redistribution of effort in response to the changing relationship between structure and environment. The Endurance, still physically embedded within the Weddell Sea pack ice, now exists in a condition where its presence is no longer defined by movement or navigation, but by its role as a fixed point within a broader and increasingly active external field. In documented Antarctic expeditions, such transitions occur not as singular decisions but as layered responses to environmental constraint, where the boundary between shipboard life and external survival becomes less distinct over time. Within this shift, the ice ceases to function solely as an enclosing medium and begins to serve as the only available surface capable of supporting continued activity. In accounts of Antarctic expeditions where vessels became immobilized within pack ice, documented survival strategies often included staged relocation of essential provisions onto adjacent ice formations when onboard conditions ceased to support sustained operational use, reflecting a practical response to environments where the ship itself could no longer serve as the primary base of activity. Historical records of polar exploration describe similar patterns of gradual externalization, where materials are transferred in controlled phases rather than abrupt evacuation, allowing for continuous adjustment to unstable terrain conditions. The Weddell Sea environment, shaped by persistent ice movement and slow pressure redistribution, does not offer uniform stability, meaning that any relocation effort must account for subtle variations in surface strength and elevation. In such conditions, the process of moving supplies becomes less about distance travelled and more about identifying temporary zones of support within a shifting field. Large-scale movement of supplies begins in controlled phases, with equipment transported across uneven ice sections whose stability varies continuously under the influence of slow environmental drift and pressure redistribution, requiring repeated reassessment of each section before weight can be safely applied. Heavy objects once secured within the vessel's structured interior must now be managed within an environment where load-bearing capacity is not fixed, but dependent on the momentary configuration of ice beneath them. This introduces a logistical condition where progress is measured not in relocation distance alone, but in the successful identification of surfaces that remain stable long enough to complete transfer. The ice does not provide consistent resistance, nor does it remain static between operations, meaning that each stage of movement exists independently of the last. Despite remaining physically intact within the ice field, the ship gradually loses its role as an active working platform, functioning instead as a stationary landmark within an expanding external area of activity, where its presence becomes more referential than operational. In maritime contexts, vessels typically function as both transportation and a base of operations, but under immobilized conditions this dual role is separated, leaving the ship as a fixed structure rather than a dynamic system. The surrounding environment begins to define activity more than the vessel itself, as operations extend outward across ice surfaces that no longer function as temporary extensions of the ship, but as independent working areas. This reconfiguration alters the spatial logic of the expedition, shifting the centre of activity away from the hull and into the surrounding field. Across nearby ice surfaces, initial organisational patterns emerge as provisions and equipment are positioned in relation to naturally occurring ridges and depressions that determine relative stability, with placement decisions guided by the physical characteristics of the ice, rather than predetermined structural planning. The surface of the Weddell Sea pack ice is not uniform, but composed of irregular formations shaped by long-term compression and drift, producing variations in height and density that influence how weight can be distributed. Within this environment, spatial arrangement becomes an adaptive process, where the suitability of each location is determined through immediate observation rather than fixed design. The resulting configuration reflects the underlying structure of the ice itself, which continues to act as the primary organising factor for all external activity. Beneath these newly established surface arrangements, the ice continues its gradual lateral movement, producing small but persistent shifts that require ongoing adjustment of stored materials and spatial layout, as no arrangement remains fully stable over extended periods. Antarctic pack ice is known from observational studies to undergo slow deformation even when appearing visually static, driven by long-range pressure gradients and wind influence that operate across large spatial scales. These movements are often subtle enough to be imperceptible in short-term observation, yet sufficient to alter the relative positioning of objects placed upon the surface. As a result, any established arrangement must remain flexible, capable of being reconfigured in response to gradual environmental change that does not present itself through abrupt disruption, but through continuous, low-intensity adjustment. Over extended periods of adaptation, survival practices become increasingly governed by the movement of the ice itself, replacing the vessel as the primary reference system for planning and positioning, as orientation and activity are now determined by environmental behaviour rather than structural stability. In polar conditions where fixed ground is absent, reference points must be derived from shifting surfaces that cannot guarantee consistency, requiring constant reassessment of spatial relationships. This introduces a mode of operation in which environmental motion becomes the baseline condition rather than an external variable, and all planning must account for that ongoing displacement. The ship, while still physically present, no longer defines the operational centre of activity, as its role has been absorbed into a broader system governed by the behaviour of the ice field. In the quiet persistence of drifting ice beneath an unchanging sky, the emerging patterns of movement begin to define a journey that no longer recognises the presence of its original point of departure, the drift across a dying ocean. No longer anchored to any fixed reference on land or ship, the drifting ice mass begins to register movement that emerges from forces operating entirely beyond the limits of immediate perception, where what appears stationary on the surface is continuously shaped by deep ocean circulation and atmospheric pressure acting across vast distances. The Weddell Sea, situated within the broader Southern Ocean system, has long been identified in polar oceanographic studies as a region influenced by large-scale rotational flow patterns. Yet within the immediate experience of those carried upon its ice, these mechanisms do not present themselves as observable motion, but as a slow, cumulative displacement that resists direct awareness. The environment offers no clear indication of direction or destination, only a persistent sense that position is no longer stable in relation to any remembered point on land or sea. Within this condition, movement becomes something that is recorded only after it has already occurred, never while it is happening. Oceanographic mapping of the Weddell Sea describes the presence of a broad cyclonic circulation known as the Weddell Gyre, where water slowly rotates within a semi-enclosed system that influences long-term ice transport patterns through gradual redistribution of heat, salinity, and momentum across deepened surface layers. This system does not operate on scales visible from the surface alone, but its effects accumulate over time as ice is drawn into slow, rotational pathways that can persist for extended periods without interruption. The gyre's motion is not abrupt or directional in a conventional sense, but continuous and distributed, producing a circulation pattern that affects ice movement across hundreds of kilometres. For anything embedded within this system, position becomes relative to shifting currents rather than fixed geographic coordinates. Far beyond the immediate polar basin, the Antarctic circumpolar current forms the only oceanic current that flows uninterrupted around the globe, carrying water and sea ice eastward across multiple oceanic sectors, while connecting the Atlantic, Pacific and Indian Ocean systems into a single continuous flow structure. This current is driven by strong westerly winds and operates without continental obstruction, allowing it to maintain a persistent eastward movement that influences climate and ocean exchange on a planetary scale. In polar regions, its interaction with colder water masses contributes to the transport and redistribution of sea ice, linking localized conditions to global oceanic circulation. Within this broader framework, isolated ice formations are not separate from global systems, but part of a continuous exchange of movement and energy that extends far beyond any single region. Separated from any fixed grounding, the ice flow functions as a passive carrier within the ocean system, its movement dictated by the combined influence of wind stress on the surface and deep current flow beneath, producing a trajectory that is not selected or controlled but imposed through environmental interaction. The flow does not generate motion independently, but responds to external forces that act across different layers of the ocean-atmosphere boundary. Wind contributes surface drag that shifts ice direction over shorter time intervals, while subsurface currents influence longer-term displacement patterns that accumulate gradually. Together, these forces create a composite movement pattern in which the flow becomes part of a larger physical system rather than an isolated object within it. Without navigational bearings or visible terrestrial markers, orientation gradually shifts toward interpreting relative ice motion as the only remaining indicator of directional change, though even this measure becomes increasingly abstract as surrounding formations move in parallel rather than in opposition. Traditional navigation depends on fixed reference points such as coastline, celestial positioning, or mapped coordinates, yet within the drifting pack ice of the Southern Ocean, these references are no longer accessible or reliable. As a result, spatial awareness becomes dependent on observing subtle differences in movement between ice sections, where relative displacement replaces absolute position. Over time, this form of orientation loses precision, as all visible reference points are themselves in motion. Over extended durations, displacement accumulates in ways that remain largely imperceptible to direct observation, despite producing significant spatial relocation across the broader ocean system. meaning that movement is occurring continuously, even when no immediate change appears evident from one interval of observation to the next. This characteristic of slow cumulative motion is a defining feature of large-scale oceanic circulation, where small incremental shifts combine into substantial geographic transitions over time. In such conditions, the absence of perceptible change does not indicate stillness, but rather movement occurring at a scale that exceeds normal human observational thresholds. The result is a form of travel without experiential continuity, where distance is traversed without the perception of progression. At a scale beyond immediate human observation, the interaction between atmosphere, ocean circulation, and sea ice forms a continuous physical system in which movement is distributed rather than directed, meaning that no single element controls the trajectory of the whole, but each contributes to its overall behavior through interconnected forces. This system operates through feedback loops between wind stress, ocean currents, and ice response, producing patterns that evolve without fixed endpoints or predetermined paths. Within this framework, any individual component becomes part of a larger dynamic equilibrium that cannot be separated into isolated cause and effect. The drifting formation is therefore not moving through the system so much as participating within it. Carried farther from any fixed point of return, the drifting system leaves time measured less by movement and increasingly by what can no longer be sustained. The slow erosion of time and hunger, and what once functioned as orientation through movement and position, gradually gives way to a condition where duration itself becomes the only remaining framework through which experience can be understood, and within this shift, the drifting existence no longer registers change through distance, but through the slow unfolding of time without external confirmation of progress. In polar expedition conditions such as those documented in early 20th century Antarctic voyages, the absence of reliable navigation markers can alter the way time is perceived, not because time itself changes, but because the usual structures used to measure it, travel, landmarks, environmental transition, are no longer available to reinforce its passage. The Weddell Sea environment, already removed from conventional navigational reference by prolonged ice coverage and drift-based movement, offers no stable external rhythm against which daily progression can be compared. As a result, time begins to exist as a condition observed internally rather than verified externally, and its passage becomes increasingly detached from any measurable change in position. Scientific observations from polar physiology research consistently show that sustained exposure to extreme cold environments requires continuous metabolic energy output simply to preserve internal thermal stability, as the human body must maintain core temperature through ongoing caloric expenditure even in states of minimal physical activity. This process, known in cold environment physiology as thermogenic maintenance, increases baseline energy demand significantly compared to temperate conditions, meaning that survival in such environments depends not only on shelter and clothing, but on a continuous intake of energy-rich food sources. In extended polar expeditions, this biological requirement becomes a structural constraint on all other systems of activity, because energy availability directly influences cognitive function, physical endurance, and operational capacity. Within environments where resupply is impossible, this creates a fixed relationship between stored provisions and time itself, linking biological sustainability directly to resource consumption rates. Provisioning systems used in early 20th century Antarctic expeditions were typically designed around strict ration allocation models intended to extend finite food supplies across unpredictable periods of isolation, with careful measurement of daily intake forming a central component of long-duration survival planning. These systems were based on calculated estimates of energy requirements under extreme conditions, adjusted for the expectation that expeditions might face delays far beyond planned timelines. Historical records from polar exploration show that such rationing was not simply logistical, but structural, shaping daily routines through predefined quantities and schedules that governed consumption behavior. In conditions where no external resupply is available, the ration system becomes the primary organizing framework for survival, determining not only physical endurance, but also the temporal structure of life aboard or within a stranded expedition. In the absence of any measurable environmental progression, the act of consuming stored provisions begins to function as one of the only remaining indicators that time is continuing to pass, as each measured reduction in supply provides a tangible record of elapsed duration. Without movement across distance or change in external landscape, internal resources become the only variable that consistently decreases predictably. This creates a reversal of typical temporal reference systems, where instead of time measuring consumption, consumption begins to measure time. Each allocation taken from stores becomes an implicit marker of continuity, not because it signifies progress, but because it confirms that a cycle is completed and cannot be reversed. Over time, this mechanism replaces external observation as the primary method of understanding passage. Operational routines that once followed navigational necessity now continue in reduced form, increasingly structured around preservation of resources rather than external movement or planning, reflecting a shift in priorities from expansion to maintenance. In maritime and expedition contexts, daily procedures typically exist to support navigation, safety, and progression toward a destination. But when movement ceases to produce change in position, these routines are redefined by internal constraints. Tasks such as equipment checks, environmental monitoring, and structural maintenance continue, but their purpose becomes less about advancement and more about sustaining the conditions necessary for continued existence. This transformation does not eliminate structure, but it alters its function, turning operational rhythm into a system of conservation rather than progression. With the surrounding ice field offering no meaningful variation over extended observation, attention becomes concentrated almost entirely on internal conditions and the management of remaining supplies, as external stimuli no longer provide sufficient differentiation to structure perception. In environments where visual and spatial change is minimal or absent, cognitive focus naturally shifts toward variables that still exhibit measurable variation. Within the context of a stranded expedition, these variables are primarily internal: resource levels, physical condition, and the integrity of stored materials. As a result, observation becomes inward-facing, not through psychological choice, but through environmental limitation, as the external world ceases to offer new information capable of supporting situational interpretation. When external reference points cease to provide reliable markers of change, both spatial awareness and temporal perception begin to degrade into internally measured cycles of consumption and maintenance, where understanding of progression is derived from repetitive internal processes rather than environmental confirmation. Without movement across terrain or variation in surroundings, spatial awareness loses its external anchors and becomes dependent on relative positioning within a static field. Similarly, temporal awareness loses its external structure and is reconstructed through routine cycles that repeat regardless of environmental conditions. This convergence of spatial and temporal reference into internal systems creates a closed framework of perception, in which continuity is maintained not by external validation, but by repetition of essential processes. As the remaining provisions continue to diminish through controlled use, the structure of survival advances into a condition increasingly defined by what can no longer be extended: the decision to walk toward nothing. The diminishing margin between stored provisions and continued survival reaches a point where further extension becomes structurally impossible, while the ice field beneath them begins to fragment into conditions no longer capable of supporting sustained occupation, forcing a redefinition of survival that is no longer anchored to a fixed platform but to the possibility of movement across an unstable and unverified surface. In Antarctic expedition records, such transitions are not marked by singular decisions, but by accumulated recognition that static positioning on deteriorating ice increases exposure to environmental risk, particularly when fragmentation reduces the continuity of usable terrain. The Weddell Sea region, already characterized by slow drift and pressure-driven deformation, now presents a surface that no longer behaves as a connected system, but as a scattering of independent sections, each responding differently to wind stress and oceanic motion beneath. Historical Antarctic field observations describe how extensive pack ice formations can fracture under combined environmental stresses, including wind-driven displacement, temperature fluctuation, and internal pressure redistribution across connected flow systems, resulting in the progressive separation of surfaces that once functioned as a single structural field. This process does not occur uniformly but develops unevenly across large spatial scales, where some sections remain temporarily stable while adjacent areas weaken and separate. Over time, the integrity of the ice field transitions from continuous support to fragmented instability, creating conditions in which movement across the surface requires constant reassessment of structural reliability. Within such environments, Stability is not a fixed property, but a temporary state dependent on shifting environmental forces. When structural continuity between ice sections deteriorates, the surface transitions into a fragmented network of independent platforms that shift unpredictably under ocean swell and subsurface motion, requiring any attempt at traversal to account for movement that is not visible at the moment of stepping. Each section of ice responds to pressure differently depending on thickness, internal stress distribution, and contact with surrounding flows, meaning that the terrain itself becomes an active variable in movement rather than a passive surface. In polar conditions, this fragmentation is further influenced by tidal forces and long-period swell penetrating beneath the ice, subtly altering elevation and spacing between flows, even in the absence of surface-level indicators. As a result, continuity of travel can no longer be assumed, only tested moment by moment. Expedition survival decision-making frameworks generally identify abandonment of stationary ice positions as a gradual process informed by cumulative risk assessment rather than isolated structural failure events, where the decision to relocate emerges from repeated observation of declining stability rather than a single catastrophic trigger. In historical polar expeditions, such decisions were often delayed until the balance between risk of remaining and risk of movement reached a narrow margin, requiring careful evaluation of environmental conditions that could not be fully predicted. The absence of reliable external support or resupply systems intensifies this calculation, as remaining stationary does not guarantee safety when the supporting surface itself is undergoing continuous transformation. Within this context, movement becomes less an option and more a response to the loss of environmental predictability. Transitioning from stationary encampment conditions to over-ice travel introduces a fundamentally altered survival dynamic in which movement is governed entirely by surface variability rather than environmental enclosure, shifting the basis of endurance from passive resistance to active negotiation with terrain. Unlike structured travel on stable land, movement across fractured ice requires continuous adaptation to irregular elevation, separation gaps, and shifting load-bearing capacity. Historical sledging practices in Antarctic expeditions reflect this dependency on surface conditions, where progress is measured not only by distance, but by the feasibility of each step across unstable terrain. In this mode of survival, forward motion is never guaranteed to be continuous, but instead assembled from intermittent opportunities for passage. In the absence of distinguishable geographic markers, navigational certainty becomes increasingly compromised, as uniform ice terrain and low-visibility atmospheric conditions obscure directional verification, leaving only estimated alignment based on prior observation and limited reference systems. Polar environments are known to produce whiteout conditions in which horizon, surface, and sky merge into a continuous visual field, eliminating contrast needed for spatial orientation. Under such conditions, traditional navigation techniques lose reliability, and movement becomes dependent on internal judgment rather than external confirmation. This introduces a condition where direction is maintained through intention rather than verification, increasing uncertainty with every incremental advance. Each successive advance across the ice introduces a progression into areas where positional certainty cannot be independently confirmed, leaving movement dependent on estimated direction rather than verified outcome, and transforming travel into a sequence of decisions made without guaranteed spatial feedback. Over time, this method of progression alters the perception of distance itself, as advancement can no longer be measured against fixed reference points. Instead, movement is assessed through continuity of effort rather than confirmation of location, producing a form of travel where completion is never fully verifiable in real time. The landscape does not provide confirmation of progress, only the absence of reversal. Beyond the fractured expanse of drifting ice, the surrounding silence extends without measurable boundary, carrying forward a movement whose destination remains unverified by any visible reference. Elephant Island, the edge of survival. After prolonged movement across unstable and unverified terrain, forward progression finally intersects with a fixed land boundary, where the shift from drift to grounded surface does not alter environmental severity but only its form, as the expedition enters a landscape that offers physical contact with land, yet continues to deny any meaningful reduction in isolation or exposure. Historical accounts of Antarctic travel describe such transitions not as resolutions but as reconfigurations of difficulty, where arrival at land does not guarantee safety, resupply, or connectivity, particularly in regions far removed from established maritime routes. The change in setting from moving ice to stationary terrain, therefore, represents a shift in structural conditions rather than an easing of survival constraints, as the environmental system continues to operate without regard to human presence or expectation. Geographically situated within the South Shetland Islands, Elephant Island is defined by steep, ice-covered terrain and heavily exposed coastlines shaped by continuous interaction with Southern Ocean swell and glacial erosion, producing a shoreline that is both unstable and difficult to access even under favourable conditions. The island lies at the northern edge of the Antarctic Peninsula region, where weather systems moving through the Southern Ocean frequently intensify before reaching land, resulting in rapidly changing coastal conditions. Its topography is dominated by rugged cliffs and glaciated slopes that descend sharply into cold, turbulent waters, limiting the number of locations where landing is physically possible. Within this configuration, the island functions less as a hospitable environment and more as an exposed geological surface surrounded by a persistent oceanic force. Historical expedition records indicate that access to Elephant Island's coastline is limited to intermittent landing opportunities where local sea and ice conditions briefly allow approach by small craft, often requiring precise timing in narrow windows of relative stability. During early 20th century Antarctic expeditions, such landings were conducted under conditions where swell, wind, and drifting ice could change rapidly, altering coastal accessibility within short time frames. The absence of natural harbours or sheltered inlets further complicates the approach, meaning that any landing attempt depends on transient environmental alignment rather than predictable access routes. As a result, arrival at the island's shore is not a single stable event, but a moment contingent on shifting physical conditions. Among the few accessible coastal areas, the region later known as Point Wild consists of relatively flatter terrain positioned beneath elevated ice cliffs that provide minimal shielding from surrounding atmospheric exposure, creating a narrow zone where occupation is physically possible but environmentally constrained. Historical documentation of Antarctic survival camps indicates that such locations are often selected not for comfort or protection in absolute terms, but for relative comparison against more extreme surrounding terrain. At Point Wild, the proximity of steep ice formations above and open ocean conditions below creates a setting where exposure is constant from multiple directions. Even within this limited area, the stability of ground and shelter conditions remain subject to ongoing environmental influence. Even after reaching solid ground, the surrounding environment continues to function as an isolated system with no permanent human infrastructure or established logistical support available on the island, leaving no external framework to support sustained occupation. In polar regions such as this, isolation is not defined solely by distance, but by the absence of integrated systems of supply, communication, and recovery. The physical act of reaching land does not alter these structural limitations, as the island remains disconnected from regular maritime routes and any permanent settlement infrastructure. Within this context, landfall does not signify reintegration into human systems but continued separation from them. Regional weather behaviour in this sector of the Southern Ocean is influenced by persistent cyclonic activity and polar atmospheric circulation patterns that generate rapidly changing wind and sea conditions, producing an environment where atmospheric and oceanic systems interact continuously without long-term stabilisation. Meteorological records from the region describe frequent shifts in pressure systems that can alter local conditions over short periods, affecting visibility, wind intensity, and sea state simultaneously. These dynamic patterns contribute to an environment where external conditions remain variable, even in the absence of seasonal transition. As a result, the surrounding atmosphere functions as an active system rather than a static backdrop to survival. Continuation of life on the island depends entirely on existing provisions and the capacity to maintain temporary shelter under ongoing environmental pressure, as no external resupply or communication infrastructure is available, leaving survival constrained within a closed system defined by finite resources and persistent exposure. In such conditions, resource management becomes the primary determinant of duration, as energy intake, shelter integrity, and environmental protection must be balanced without external supplementation. The absence of communication pathways further reinforces this isolation, removing any mechanism for coordination or assistance beyond the immediate environment, Within this structure, survival is maintained only through internal regulation of limited means. From the isolated shoreline, the surrounding ocean stretches outward without interruption, forming the only visible corridor between confinement and any possibility of return. The boat journey across the furious ocean. Once the shoreline ceases to function as a boundary, movement away from land becomes an enforced transition into open ocean conditions where direction is no longer defined by destination but by exposure to continuous maritime force, and the small boat enters a system where progression is measured not by navigation in a traditional sense, but by the ability to remain intact within a moving and unbounded environment. In the context of early 20th century Antarctic exploration, such departures were not symbolic acts of escape but calculated responses to survival constraints, where leaving land often represented the only remaining option for reaching external assistance. The Southern Ocean beyond Elephant Island presents no gradual easing of conditions, only an immediate shift into fully exposed maritime dynamics, where wind, swell, and current operate without obstruction from land masses. Accounts of early 20th century Antarctic expeditions describe small open boats, reinforced for ice contact, yet still fundamentally limited in protection against prolonged wave impact and extreme weather exposure, reflecting the technological constraints of maritime design in an era before modern polar navigation support systems. These vessels were typically constructed of wood, with structural reinforcement intended to distribute stress from wave impact and ice contact, yet they remained vulnerable to sustained pressure from large ocean swells. In extreme southern latitudes, the absence of protective coastlines means that such craft must endure conditions that would otherwise be moderated by geographic shelter. Within this context, the journey becomes less about controlled travel and more about sustained structural survival within a hostile fluid environment. Across the Southern Ocean, the interaction between the Antarctic circumpolar current and persistent westerly wind belts generates uninterrupted swell systems capable of circulating around the globe without obstruction, producing wave patterns that retain energy across vast distances and extended timeframes. This oceanic current system is unique in that it connects multiple major ocean basins, allowing water and wave energy to circulate continuously around the Antarctic continent without interruption from land. The resulting swell conditions are not localized but part of a planetary-scale system of motion that influences maritime environments far beyond the immediate region of travel. Within this framework, the small boat is not moving through isolated water, but through a continuous energy field shaped by global circulation dynamics. During early polar navigation practices, positioning at sea relied on celestial observation and dead reckoning, methods that lose precision when visibility is reduced and reference points are absent, particularly in regions where cloud cover, spray, and horizon indistinction are frequent. Celestial navigation requires clear observation of sun or star positions relative to a known horizon, while dead reckoning depends on estimated speed and direction over time, both of which become increasingly uncertain under unstable environmental conditions. In the Southern Ocean, frequent cloud cover and low contrast lighting conditions often obscure visual reference points, making precise navigation difficult to maintain over extended periods. As a result, positional certainty becomes progressively approximate, with each adjustment based on incomplete observational input. Regional meteorological systems frequently develop into fast-moving low-pressure formations that alter wind strength, wave height, and atmospheric visibility over short and unpredictable intervals, producing rapidly changing conditions that affect both surface and aerial dynamics simultaneously. These systems can intensify without long warning periods, resulting in sudden shifts in wind velocity and wave formation that alter maritime conditions within hours. In open southern waters, such changes are particularly significant due to the absence of land-based buffering systems that might otherwise reduce their intensity. The interaction between atmospheric pressure systems and ocean surface response creates an environment where stability is temporary and continuously redefined by incoming weather patterns. Under repeated wave impact, small wooden hulls experience continuous structural flexing, where movement between water and vessel becomes a constant exchange of force rather than isolated contact events, with each wave contributing incremental stress across the vessel's frame. This flexing is not uniform but varies depending on wave direction, height, and frequency, resulting in an uneven distribution of mechanical load across different sections of the hull. Over time, The accumulation of these forces requires constant adjustment in handling and positioning to maintain structural integrity. In such conditions, the vessel operates less as a stable platform and more as a responsive structure continuously adapting to external motion. Extended periods of exposure to open ocean conditions create a survival state defined by uninterrupted environmental interaction, where endurance is measured through sustained response rather than periods of rest or stability, as there are no extended intervals free from external influence. The absence of sheltered conditions means that physical and cognitive resources must be maintained under continuous environmental stress, without the opportunity for full recovery. In maritime survival contexts, this creates a condition where fatigue accumulates not in discrete cycles, but as a continuous process influenced by ongoing exposure. The body and vessel alike operate within a persistent state of adjustment to external forces that do not pause or diminish over time. The fading line of departure dissolves into uninterrupted ocean space, where movement continues without visible convergence, yet begins to extend through a passage of time that no longer matches the speed of travel itself. The return, that took 500 days to arrive. Progress across the open Southern Ocean continues without visible convergence, but the absence of any fixed geographic reference gradually transforms navigation into a condition dependent on whether external systems are still capable of re-establishing contact with the vessel's position, and within this extended uncertainty, the concept of movement begins to lose its usual association with measurable progress. In the context of early 20th century polar expeditions, this phase of separation from land-based communication systems represents not only physical isolation, but also informational isolation, where the status of a stranded party may remain unknown to outside observers for prolonged periods. The ocean, already defined by scale and lack of interruption, becomes the final medium through which any possibility of contact must be re-established, though it offers no indication of whether such reconnection will occur. Historical documentation of the Shackleton expedition records multiple rescue attempts from Elephant Island that were halted or delayed by extensive sea ice formations and rapidly changing pack conditions in the surrounding waters, where shifting ice fields repeatedly prevented vessels from reaching stable approach positions. These attempts were constrained by the unpredictable nature of Antarctic sea ice, which can expand or contract rapidly under changing wind and temperature conditions, altering navigable channels within short time frames. Each attempt to reach the stranded crew was therefore dependent on environmental alignment, rather than purely navigational skill, as even well-prepared vessels were subject to the limits imposed by ice distribution and sea state. Within this system, access to the island was never guaranteed, only intermittently possible. Successful extraction of the stranded crew was ultimately achieved by the Chilean steam tug Yelcho, commanded by Captain Luis Pardo, who managed to penetrate ice-affected waters that had previously prevented other vessels from reaching the site, marking the first successful arrival after multiple failed attempts under severe environmental constraints. Historical records describe the Yelcho as a relatively small vessel compared to larger ships involved in earlier attempts, yet it was able to navigate through narrow openings in the pack ice during a brief period of improved conditions. The success of this approach depended on timing, persistence, and the temporary formation of a navigable corridor through otherwise impassable ice fields. This moment represents not a transformation of conditions, but a brief convergence of factors that allowed passage where none had previously existed. Throughout the rescue period, dense and shifting ice fields surrounding Elephant Island created persistent barriers that limited vessel access and required precise timing to exploit brief openings in the pack, with ice movement continuously reshaping potential routes of approach. Sea ice in this region does not remain static but moves under the influence of wind stress, ocean currents, and internal pressure, meaning that navigable gaps may appear and close within short intervals. For vessels attempting to approach, this creates a dynamic environment where successful passage depends on continuous reassessment of conditions. In such circumstances, navigation becomes less about fixed routes and more about identifying transient opportunities within a constantly changing field. Periods without confirmation of external rescue activity create a temporal experience in which time is no longer tracked through continuous events, but through intermittent and uncertain indications of change in the surrounding conditions, where even minor environmental variation can become a perceived marker of possible progress. In isolation scenarios, the absence of consistent external feedback alters how duration is understood, as the usual alignment between events and time progression is no longer reinforced by communication or observation. Instead, time is inferred through indirect signals, such as environmental shifts or the passage of supplies and routine cycles. This produces a fragmented sense of continuity in which certainty about duration becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. Completion of rescue operations occurred not through a gradual approach, but through a brief alignment of navigational feasibility and environmental conditions that allowed a single successful passage through otherwise impassable waters, creating a narrow window in which extraction became possible. In maritime operations within polar regions, such moments are rare and depend on the simultaneous presence of navigable channels, acceptable weather conditions, and sufficient vessel capability. When these factors align, movement that was previously impossible becomes temporarily achievable, but only within a limited time frame. Once conditions shift again, the same route may immediately become inaccessible, reinforcing the temporary nature of success in such environments. After prolonged isolation, return to broader human contact does not immediately reconcile the disparity between lived duration and externally recorded time, leaving the experience partially detached from its final recognition, as the internal chronology of survival does not always align with external documentation of events. In extended isolation, individuals often experience time through internal cycles shaped by survival routines rather than external calendars or records. When reintegration occurs, these internal timelines do not automatically synchronize with external references, creating a mismatch between perceived duration and recorded history. This separation does not imply distortion, but rather differing frameworks of temporal understanding shaped by environment and context. Even when the journey is formally complete and the ocean is no longer crossed, the sequence of movement, drift, and silence it contained remains only partially reconstructed by the limits of what could be observed at the time.